What's the best decade for performance car enthusiasts? Let's talk about it right now. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Carside Chat. I am your host, Primo, and I am getting better at this. I don't know. I used to have a team. Now it's just me. But I'm doing more and more with trying to get this stuff situated out. We get more equipment coming in. I actually have my nice lights and, everything looks good. So I'm actually kind of happy about, where we're going forward here. I hope you guys are liking it. We're trying hard. I'm getting a lot of really good input for everybody. I hope that you continue to do that. Make sure to put your comments in the comment section below, because that's something that really helps us out a lot. For those of you who are on, we're going to have some visuals today, obviously. So for those of you that are on some of the groups like Spotify and stuff like that, if you have a chance, you can come over to our YouTube channel, because it's something that we have everything there. So don't forget to like and subscribe, do all that stuff. So yeah, I like to get all the what do you call it? All the little things over with early. Everybody's like, yeah, you got to do this stuff and add this and be professional and stuff. I obviously hate asking for subscriptions. I'd rather just give you the content and show it off, and then hopefully you like it, and then you sign up that way. So good world out, right? So the last couple of days we were talking, we had Dave Gallagher on at the beginning of the week. So I did, as I fix my mic here, wanted to do a little update here to show you after they cleaned it up. So this is the car now, which is incredible. Look at that shine, man. Prestige and Elite Auto Detailing up in New Hampshire. Incredible work that they do all the time. And I'm amazed. Like, you saw how, if you didn't see the video before, you should go back and take a look at it. We covered it. It was an early barn find. He's had it for a couple of days now and has done incredible things with that car in a short amount of time. So I don't know. That's just crazy. Like, just to see that. So I'm hoping that, and the thing is everybody leave some comments about getting into that, especially here. Go back to the original video. Give us your thoughts on what you want done with that, what your input is. I continue to fly back to the idea that I want to see this car on the road. I want to see it with an engine, and I want to see it definitely with a 12-cylinder, funny enough. So that's something it is what it is. So I'm hoping that we continue to kind of motivate him to go in a certain direction, but who knows? I'm going to need your responses for it. I'm going to need everybody on it. So yeah, anywhere in here that you can put a comment where you're listening to this, whatever platform, put it in there. Let's hear it. So today's kind of thing that we're going over right now is really we had this conversation the other day between a couple of friends. It was like, what was the best decade for performance car folks? One of the guys like, hey, you know what? Let's look at it all and just kind of buzz it down a little bit. But we never had time to really do it, and it is a really odd thing to kind of go over, to kind of feel out what's the best year or the best decade, or kind of zone it down of what was the best time to do it. That's why I kind of ran with the decade thing, because I just think that is the best way to put it, to be zoned in such an opening, to kind of capture all the different years. And the thing is if I'm going to start this anywhere, I'm going to start it in the 1960s. I'd like to start it in the 10s, 20s, 30s, 40s, that kind of thing. I mean, obviously it would be amazing to be involved in the years that Blake's Ford Model T and Model A were out, and see where that came from. I mean, these are the years that back then was the first time they ever did financing on vehicles, was, I believe, the Model A. And Ford was actually very reluctant. There were other companies that did it first, but they talked about financing. Hey, people couldn't afford cars, so the best way to do it is to find a way for them to, be able to take some sort of financing and be able to purchase a car that, these cars aren't cheap. So, and I think how's the wording of it? It's the second biggest investment that people will make in their lifetime, is between buying a house and buying a car. So, it kind of made sense. But, and that thing is we can go to the 1920s, the 1930s, all the stuff that really kind of, zoned it. A lot of hot rods and that kind of stuff came out of those times. But the real time that I think real car guys started becoming real car guys, not just, this does a job. Just in other words, when it started being a horse and started being a car, I want to say it's the 60s. And not that I lived through it. So if you guys are out there and somebody was around in the 60s, hey, put it in the comments. Let me know what was said or what made difference or what was so important about that time that you had that was kind of a bigger year. So yeah, like I said, we're going to go into that, and I want to start with the 1960s. So the 1960s was the year that the Mustang and the Camaro, they started incredible competition, and that was a time that continued to this day. There was a lot of muscle car was really starting to get their footing, but the 60s was, I think about it, kind of wasn't a great year for their power. They're really getting their footing for it. It was also the year of the GT40, the DB5. And if you're ever going to talk about any kind of muscle cars, the Chevelle has to be part of this equation. So the Chevelle came out again. It really started off kind of but then it really picked up, and it really did some big things with it. And the thing is I wouldn't be right if we didn't put the Impala in this list. The Impala came out, kind of a staple car today, has different genres that it really fits into, and it had a long and illustrious life. Also, the Porsche got its looks in the 911, became what it was in the 60s. So what we saw at that time was going to be something that's going to be really consistent down the road. So really, I think for the 1960s, we're starting to see these kind of cars get kind of a footing. In other words, people are kind of looking at cars in a different way. So if it's anything has a stake in being the best decade for the cars, it has to be the 1960s. But the truth is, the 1960s, they were still getting their bearing. The 1960s were foundational years. The best versions of cars really didn't hit their stride in the 60s. They were really getting started. So the Corvette that you would see in the 60s is not going to be the Corvette that you're going to see in the 80s, 90s. And we started getting traditional styles, as we went further down. So now we move into the 1970s. And they started off with strikes, problems. Some cars got a ton of power while others suffered. What's worse is the compact car competition began. They tried to compete domestically against compact cars, and they didn't do a very good job of it. Perfect example is, for instance, the Gremlin. I can't think of moving a Gremlin forward and saying, yeah, that's the Gremlin, that's the one. But that thing is, insurance got involved. They argued for low-speed bumpers, and this is when California starts arguing that pollution is a problem. So what's new with them, right? So now automakers are bragging about bumpers and fuel economy. We're not thinking about power anymore. We're thinking about other options. One thing that you kind of saw back then too was the 1971, the electric cars. And even steam was considered at that market, but nothing really came of it. So 1974, we got an oil embargo that didn't do us any favors. Prices went up, interest went down. BMW introduced their 3 Series, so that was kind of a big deal. But the 70s were the years for the Japanese automaker to really start getting their foothold. The 1970s brought about, obviously, the Countach came out, so we're going to get a little bit of steam change when it comes to the 1970s, but notably wise, I think 1970s and the 1960s were just a trend. Like I said, 60s still has a good competition for being the top dog here, but 1970s, it didn't do too well. So now for the 1980s, this is where our real pain began. Gas problems, lead in fuel, all this other stuff, it all began to come home to roost. So cars were underpowered, gas, smog, boats of cars. A lot of this getting more and more into this compact genre. The 80s did not do us any favors. What the 80s did do was it was a load of... It just loaded us the breach for the 90s. In other words, what would be the big deal for the 80s was really going to fuel the 90s. So, for instance, the Vector W8, the DeLorean, the Buick GNX. You had really good notable cars. The Countach really started to get traction, so we started stuff like Gumball. Even cars that had been underpowered became popular, like the Trans Am and the Corvette. It was still something that kids were getting into. And aftermarket companies were really getting a foothold. They were happy to fill the void with ways to unlock all that lost power, which led to breaking the 200 mile per hour barrier by the end of the year in a street-driven vehicle. It was also a crazy decade for movie cars, and this is where really started to see people, a lot of people like myself, included, especially in our age group. I forgot what generation we are. I don't think it really matters, but we really started to get into stuff, and the reason that we got into it was because movies, television, Saturday morning cartoons. There was no better time for a kid to get into cars. But unfortunately, new gray market vehicle laws and all these other laws that came in also meant we lost a lot of cool cars that probably would have normally come into the States, didn't make it in. So we got kind of stifled. But in K cars, all that other stuff, a lot of the compact stuff, like I said, I certainly did not cheer about the 80s. I was not a big fan of the 80s, but it was still, we had the 60s and the cars that lulled into the 70s that were still powerful. That were still great cars. So we had that going for us. And obviously there's a little bit of kind of that luxury vehicle feel that we started getting into that I think really got more of a traction in the 80s than it did before, because people were starting to slow down. So now we're going to move into the 90s, and now things are going to get crazy. All the momentum that built up in the 80s got literally unleashed. Every commercial was about going fast. Everything was about being competitive. Domestically, the Viper, the Corvette, Camaro, Mustang, everything was coming out in the 90s, and it was just seemed like everybody had a piece. From Italy, the Diablo. Ferrari started making cars that were driver friendly to compete against a Japanese market that was being more and more competitive, and then Porsche followed suit. So they had gotten in the 80s and really gotten a good foothold. 90s, they were like, we're going to try to slam dunk this thing home. So, and let's not forget cars like the Supra, the RX-7, 300ZX, 3000 GT. It seemed like everybody had some sort of brand that was considered in that Japanese branding area that was getting some sort of footing, or had a car that was powerful and was ready to go to compete. It was the era of Need for Speed. That was it. Everybody wanted to go fast, and it was kind of a weird time, because even cars that were supposed to be regular lot cars, they had cars that were fast and were available to purchase. What was truly great about these cars was they were all really competitive, and it's one of the unique times you could purchase a Japanese car that could race an exotic car and give them a run for the money. It really did fuel the Fast and Furious scene about, how much did you spend on that car, and how more than you can afford, pal, Ferrari. That really was the 90s that fueled that thinking. Domestics were not just for the drag strip anymore. They were for taking on big fishes on racetracks. And in 1993, the McLaren took net a 231 mile per hour, and in 1998, they took the speed record of 240.1 miles per hour to solidify the spot of fastest production vehicle. And that was a huge move. It was pretty clear going in the 90s that a lot of people wanted to go the fastest, but it was kind of like, where do you go? And McLaren just pounded the nail home and said, this is our territory, get off it. And they held that hill for a very long time. And it made a lot of other people want to kind of compete against it. In other words, everybody wanted to go fast and do their thing. So it was, here's the buildup. And if you were a luxury guy, many would argue that there couldn't be a better time to be around, with aftermarket companies even more so. It was a crazy time. There just really wasn't a car that you couldn't drive and have fun with. Luxuries, BMW, all those brands, they were really, kicking it in the 20s. I mean, the 1990s. So it was a really, really cool year. And I think between the 1960s and 1990s, that's something that was huge. So for the 2000s, video games started to make their mark, and people went from driving real cars to looking at digital ones. This is also the year of hybrids got their start. And so these was real big, but the cars are getting huge, but the budget's not doing so well. The Bugatti took the world by storm, and we had a real Concorde moment here as it went into the end of the year. So they just took that top position and kind of just sat there. They the first ones to really insert the McLaren and make a statement for it, because it was a driver-friendly car. It was an actual. It wasn't just a car that was fast. It was, here's luxury. The decade started off really well, too. We saw Lamborghini with a new face, driving events, cars and coffees were catching on. So this is really when the internet started catching on, forums, information abroad. But that thing is, not all of it was good. There was really a time when we kind of realized that, this newfound monster we had was sometimes a little bit, it wasn't the smartest thing to do. So yeah, everybody first did their stuff, and then, you realize these experts you're talking to aren't experts. So hopefully we learned a little bit, but I think a lot of times we didn't. MySpace would start to bring us together, but Facebook would continue with that as it became events, and you could start planning stuff. And, we got these pop-up events that really started getting their thing. The other thing was the retro craze, and that went into full swing by about midpoint of the decade. So by the time we had, I think it was 2005, the Ford Mustang retro came in. So we had this old look, but the thing is they still wanted to master something. They still wanted to do better with the engines, and they really got a good swing with it. They started moving forward. We would end the decade in 2009 with the Tesla. So the first ever, viable, I don't know if we can say that viably, but it was the first ever time when an electric car was actually making some waves, and they were doing pretty good with it. So it was we got a good time for that. Luxury cars got a lot of people were excited too, because this is the first time, especially for car guys, you go to a track, you start seeing, I remember seeing them on Pikes Peak. I remember seeing the electric cars on drag strips. So especially with testing, it was really cool to see where that went. So, but luxury cars, they got off to a really good start, and they continued to flourish. But as things went along, they a lot of complaints went into the next couple of years that they were really not doing what they needed to do. The looks kind of got more bubbly, and people didn't feel it. So I think that was about that time that Maybach kind of was like, okay, it's time to, what are we going to do here? So certain brands started losing money, but other brands started picking up. But it seemed that the 2000s were the year that if you had money, you were doing well. But that really brings us into now that things are going to go to pot. So 2010, everything went to junk. 2010 was a recession, and for that reason, we lost a ton of potential cars, mothballing brands like Pontiac. There's a lot of new concept cars. In fact, if you look at all the concepts you probably loved or looked at that got lost, there's a good chance 2010 was the year that they had in planning. A lot of them had been introduced in the 2009, so we got really excited. Like, hey, 2010 is going to be the offshoot year, just kind of like the 1980s into 1990s. But the recession did not do us any favors. Automakers suffered, and their offerings suffered as well. If you had money, this wasn't too bad a year. All the exotics took on new looks. We got the Aventador. We got more stuff for Ferrari. A lot of big brands like obviously Koenigsegg and Pagani had already gotten some traction, and like I said, but we're talking millions of dollars here. So if you had to have big money, but those new looks were high power, big budgets, and these new automakers took this to the scene. But we lost a lot of great automakers in the same instance that really tried to come out, but they came out at a really bad time, and what ended up happening was they kind of got washed away. They died in the process. This was except for Tesla. Tesla continued to pretend like they didn't even know what a recession was. I think it's funny, Hyundai was another one that saw great growth in the middle of a recession. Obviously, Tesla basically had grant money for theirs. They borrowed money on their side of it, while brands, they basically the big buybacks for bigger companies. So the bailouts that happened with the bigger brands. So they wanted to find a way to survive. So that all that stuff played together about seeing who was big and who wasn't, which I think really plays into why Tesla did so well when some of these other brands didn't. But as we had seen it in the year, the electric started to push, and once again, companies were on the verge of bankruptcy as they were starting to build. They're trying to design this electrical stuff. So we saw brands like Lamborghini, Bentley, Rolls, following suit with Porsche, and everybody's building an SUV. And this, the way they did that was they knew it would sell, and it was a brand that would sell for them while they designed all this new technology, which is where all that money went, was into electric cars. So as we come into the 2020s, and obviously I do want to touch on that a little bit, like kind of where we would be. Do we have the potential of having a great year? And so far, it hasn't done too well. The pandemic, the chip crisis, and now with the continued inflation, as well as electric cars being told that, litigated into the idea that, you can't have anything but electric cars. The thing is right now, these brands, especially the older cars, are actually going up in price too. So the goal here is going to be, if you want to do anything now, my suggestion is get rich, because these prices are only going to go up. You're only going to see brands that are, these old cars are only going to get more expensive. We're seeing Countach's, for instance, go back. They're going to be in the millions very, very soon. Anything that's manual, shifted, all that stuff, it's something that you're going to want to think about saying now it's going to be collector car season, but again, it's going to be money oriented. So what I see as we go into the 2000s and probably going into the 2030 area is you're going to see more and more cars that appear to be more disposable, cars that are just made to do a certain thing. I don't know about the advent of self-driving cars. That really is something that it'll be based on the adoption of it. Like Uber and Lyft and some of these other companies, they'll probably do very well when it comes to self-driving cars if people will take the drives in them. But they have to, again, make money if they're going to move forward. So a lot of this technology, you really just kind of think about it, but people are... you know what I mean? So like I said, more disposable cars, collector guys are going to start getting into collecting more. Prices are going to continue to rise. And then the thing is I think currently owners own their cars about 12 years. I think that number is going to, I would dare say it would double, if not more. I think people are going to get into their cars. There's going to be more support for the older cars from big dealers, which I think is huge. If manufacturers want to get into supporting their old cars, like Porsche has done, other brands have gotten into it too. So you can take an old car, buy a car from the 70s or 80s and get stuff for it. I mean, you might as well make it available for them. So now let's get to the conclusion. What was the best year? And that's where things get kind of weird for me. I want to say the 1990s. But the 1990s was kind of a weird time because we didn't have the communication. We didn't have as many events and things of that nature. And the 90s, the cars that came from the 90s really rolled over into 2000s. So I tend to think that the experience I had with having fun was we had all the cars that came in from the 90s and then shifted over in the 2000s. And we still had the 1960s cars. So we had an interesting time where cars, especially early 2000, going into 2005, that there was no line that was drawn. We didn't have or know that there was an idea that cars needed to be separated or that different classes needed to be made. We just kind of saw cars as cars. And I think because we came together in that, and what is now today, I think we've kind of screwed some of it up, but for some of it, we got it together. It was a time when you could bring a hot rod, an exotic car, a Japanese car, and a luxury European or any kind of car, bring it to the same event, and as long as they made within a certain amount of horsepower with each other, they were acceptable. So the thing is I'm going to say, if you were a car guy and you wanted to be performance-wise, it was best to have bought your car probably in the 90s into early 2000s and then started your events in 2000 to 2005, 2006. And then as 2007 and 2008, things began to start careening into different areas. So one guy will have his hot rod group, one guy will have their lowrider group, one guy would have their exotic or European thing, and things started separating, and there was no such thing as like this one show fits all kind of thing. So I think that was it. Like, if you wanted to be the buyer, you bought in the 90s to early 2000s, but you were the show guy when it came to 2000s because again, the internet. Now I can play a video game, and I just don't have. Hey, if I'm cooped up inside, I can enjoy my car on my TV. I can enjoy my car in real life. A lot of these, like, I had one of those in that video game. I actually drive it in real life. That was big. Or people started knowing each other by their ability to drive online, and now today it's you get notoriety from that. So. But that thing is, I'd rather be known for actually driving my car versus actually known for driving it online. So, different world. So, that's the thing is that's my determination on it. So, I want to hear what you guys think. Put it in the comments below. What do you think is the best year for you as a performance driver? The time that you were out, that you had the most shows, that you had the most events, you had the most fun, where things was together in a certain way. And what type of car did you drive when you had that time? That is huge. What's the what makes us who we are today has a lot to do with what kind of experience we had. If I grew up on Saturday morning cartoons, but the first time I went to car shows I had really, really bad experiences, I think I'd be a different person today than I am right now, because I went to these events and I had a lot of fun. People accepted me. We didn't matter what we drove. We all had fun. We all drove fast. We all had cool stories. And that's the thing is today, I don't know if I could do the same thing again. If we don't do stuff as police escorted now, expect the big pullovers, all that stuff. It even makes me wonder how you can have the rallies of the 2000s kind of repeated in today. I don't think it's kind of feasible, because there's just so much control, and it's getting worse and worse. There comes a point where they want to put monitors in your car that are going to self-report you. So what happens when you're driving your electric car and it says, hey, you went over the speed limit, and then tell somebody and you immediately get pulled over or dinged or ticketed or whatever? I don't know, man. That's kind of a weird world for me. I'm not sure I really want to be a part of that. So, but yeah, we'll see where that goes in the future. You just never know. Maybe it all works out, and hopefully it does. And you guys put the know. So like I said, put it in the comments. We're going to continue to do these shows. We're going to continue to put something out for you. We're always looking for ideas. We're always going to be putting some more guests on. I'm thinking about having a guest on soon to talk about what we think of the year in review here, and see what we think this year is going to represent, because I think even with the numbers going up with the pandemic right now, I'm hoping that this is going to be a big crash for it as we come into summer, and that's going to really open the floodgates for allowing us to do events. A lot of people right now, when we went into 2020, 2021, there really wasn't, even people weren't really planning. They kind of just did what they did. But as we come into 2022, we've already made plans. This is what we're going to do. This is how it's going to work. How do we work around anything that's going to get in our way? So the hope is that everything clears up, and if it does, we already got big plans. Some people are going to cancel. It is what it is, but the thing is if you have that forward momentum, you should be able to make something of it this year. So yeah, check out these other videos that we have here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Take a look at us down in the future. We got everything else. Don't forget we have our IG at Executive Automotive Society, as well as some of our other stuff right now. We're going to continue to bring you stuff. So check out these other videos. We'll talk to you soon. And this is Primo. And as always, don't forget to drive.